Okay, good morning everyone, and thank you so much for joining me here today. Great to see such a packed house so early in the day. I was asked to hold on for a few minutes because of the big delays outside, but it looks like we're pretty much full anyway. My name's David Mudd. I'm the Global Head of Digital Trust at BSI, the British Standards Institution. And we're here with, yes, yet another NIS2 talk. But I've been thinking over the last couple of weeks with some of the announcements that have been made of how to make this as relevant and interesting, a 20 minutes or so of talk and then a chance for you to ask some questions. But I'm going to start with asking a couple of questions of you first while we just wait for the last few people to come in. So NIS2, it's been close to my heart for some time, but I'm not sure about all you. So how many here are familiar with NIS2? Yeah, and are you here? Okay. So basically here to learn what's new, and I can skip through the, who is it applicable to and all that kind of stuff. You guys know all that. Okay, next question. How many here are familiar with the ISO IEC standard 27001? Quite a few as well. Great, okay. So the purpose of this talk really is how to bring these two things together. And now I've got a sense that I've got an eager audience that obviously know a lot of this anyway. I'm going to focus on adding value and skip through some of the general stuff. But just to refresh you, it will be here too. And then should have plenty of time for questions at the end. So why BSI? I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but a bit of the background to us. So we are a purpose-driven organization, independent from government and independent from shareholders, but with a mandate to work for the public good. So our role is to support you, the industry and professionals in bringing technology into the world in a trusted way for a better society. Though we've got British in the name, we are truly global, with most of our 84,000 clients and our own people actually outside of the UK, with a very strong presence here in the Netherlands. And as I said, we are a purpose-driven organization with an agent for positive change. And the two key themes for us are, first of all, the biggest issue on the planet, sustainability. And then secondly, the digital world. Because if there is one route forward for an improved, inclusive, smart society that's sustainable, it's through effective use of digital technologies. But without trust in those technologies, they will never be adopted successfully. So trust in digital technologies and cybersecurity at the heart of that is a really key mission for us. And how do we do that? We shape best practice. 27001, familiar to many of you, started off as a British standard. We're a founding member of ISO. We then provide services around that through training, certification, regulatory services, including becoming a notified body for the upcoming EU AI Act, and then consulting as well. So a wide range of services going beyond shaping the standards. But that's enough about us. Before we dive into NIS2, we've got to rethink a little bit about the why. The news isn't there's a new regulation. The news is why there's a need for the regulation in the first place. So this is not just about complying with the law in order to do business. This is about protecting the interests of you, your organization, and all of its partners and stakeholders. Cybercrime next year will become the third biggest economy on the planet behind America and China. That's the scale of what we're dealing with. We're seeing ransom as a service take yet another leap forward, as there is a big amalgamation of some really strong players here. Double extortion, rising demands, over 300 million attempts reported last year. Supply chain attacks. We're moving from supplier as weakest link to supply chain as a prime focus. You find the right organization in that supply chain, you hit them. You don't hit one organization or 10 or 100. You can hit 1,000 organizations with one attack. So the supply chain is now a primary attack vector. And we are still seeing increasing vulnerabilities. CVEs going up by 25% expected this year. So this is why NIS2 is coming in, and this is why it's so important. This really is about protecting your organization, not just about complying with the law. Also, large-scale IT outages. We've seen that through this year. So is that a cybersecurity problem? If you look at the triad of security, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, we saw with this outage, a lot of critical information was denied to hospitals, this kind of thing. So there is a really key issue around the increased risks that our digital supply chain holds. NIS2, you know all this. I could test you on it and check, but you know it, so we'll skip on. Who it applies to, again, we know all this, so I won't bore you with that. We'll move on to the interesting stuff today. So a couple of key points. We look at NIS2 and you think, oh, it's a huge amount to take on. It's very complex. How does it apply to me? I'm a small business. How does it apply to me? I'm a global business. One of the key things here is it starts with the top. It starts with management and accountability, governance here. The management of your organizations will be held liable for any infringements. They are responsible for overseeing the risk management measures that they have actually approved. And they're also required under NIS2 to go through the appropriate training. So when you're starting to worry about this as cybersecurity professionals, this is something that the whole organization is involved in, starting at the top, starting with the management, clear in black and white. A next key point along the same lines is a risk-based and a proportionate approach. Specific wording saying taking into account things such as the cost of implementation, the measures to assure an appropriate level of security to the risk posed. So this isn't one mandated list of these are all the things you have to do. You have to do what's appropriate for your organization. And then again it says, when assessing the proportionality, take into account exposure to risk, the size of the organization, the likelihood of incidents and their severity and impact. So once again, this isn't one long list of everything you have to do. This has some great advantages here in that it allows some flexibility. However, on the flip side, it also makes it rather difficult to say, well, have I done enough to make sure I'm compliant? So this is where we're seeing there's a great level of flexibility, but the biggest area of uncertainty, and I'm sure that's something that concerns a lot of you, is, yeah, I understand all that. Is this enough? Have I done enough? And this is where, as we'll see, 27001 can really help. Now, when we look at the top principles, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with these, they look quite straightforward. But behind these top 10, there are some complexities here. When you look at things like supply chain security, determining just who your direct suppliers are can be extremely complex. One simple statement here, security in the acquisition, development, and maintenance, that actually is a huge amount of activity covered by one simple statement. And then we'll take probably the best one example is number 9. That groups together human resource security, access protection, and asset management. Number 9 over there. That's a huge amount of activity. And so what, again, is appropriate under these top 10? They might seem simple, but there's a lot that's covered underneath that. So you have the top 10 to address, reporting obligations in the event of a significant incident, and then also general governance, as I've mentioned, that requirement for an holistic all hazards approach with the management being responsible for overseeing. So on one hand, we've got a relatively straightforward list of 10 requirements and a flexible approach that's allowed to do. But on the other hand, there are some real complexities within that. And how do you know with that complexity and that freedom to have a risk-based approach, what's appropriate for your organization? Now, we're starting to see transpositions into national law. They're all due to be done this month, and frankly, some countries are still a long way away from it. But we're starting to see things emerge. And so, as we move from being a directive into law into the individual nations, one thing to bear in mind, NIS2 repeatedly references use of appropriate international standards for implementation. The process will go, each country implements international law, determines national compliance requirements, and we'll see that 27001 can provide a common path for all. So it's one thing if you are just operating in one country to have one compliance route. But if you're operating 2, 3, 4, or 28, how on earth do you manage that compliance across the lot? And this is where 27001 can really help. So the example I'm going to use is Belgium, where the Centre for Cybersecurity I think, have really led the way in being proactive in coming up with a really pragmatic solution. And in Belgium, they say all essential entities must have regular compliance assessments. And they give 3 routes. They either through the Belgian scheme known as CyFun. Sounds a laugh, doesn't it? CyFun, I think I might have to take a look at that one. But in all seriousness, their own national scheme, inspection by the Belgian cybersecurity body, or certification against 27001 by an authorized certification body. Now, does certification to 27001 mean you're compliant with NIS2? The most obvious answer is no, not necessarily, possibly. But actually, if it's implemented correctly, then it draws you in to forcing you to compliance, as I'll come on to. So 27001 certification by an authorized certification body who will check that the scope and the statement of applicability are acceptable. So if your scope only covers your IT department, then there's no way that will be a justifiable route for certifying your organization for NIS2. But if your scope covers the whole organization, it will. Clause 4 on 27001 talks about the context of the organization and the need to look at your legal and contractual obligations. And you can choose whether or not to bring that into your overall statement of applicability. If you do, then inherently you'll be complying with NIS2. If you don't, then you won't. So subject to the scope and the statement of applicability being right, then that implies, in effect, you are taking NIS2 within the scope of 27001. And therefore, it becomes a relatively straightforward way of demonstrating compliance. Just going to tightly look at 27001. I know most of you are familiar, so I won't dwell on it too much. Key point, security under this definition, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Hence, the controls and requirements around business continuity within 27001. So the IT outages, etc., does address this. Another key point involves the whole organization from the leadership right the way through, helping build a culture of trust. Specifically says in the 2022 version in its title, cybersecurity. Specifically has management of the supply chain, both in the requirements, 4 supply chain controls and 1 digital supply chain control, and also specific controls around business continuity. So it absolutely addresses the core needs of NIS2. And through the framework I'll come on to very briefly, it enables that governance, management, and continual improvement. And that it provides a route for the management and the leadership to engage with the organization in a controlled fashion. So it does have over 90 security controls. But a point is that quite a lot of people miss is this is actually very flexible. I'll come on to that. You don't have to have them all, and you can also bring in other controls if required. So plan, do, check, act. If you're familiar with 27001, you'll be familiar with this. It's a phrase that's used quite a lot by the auditing and certification community. And we can be very blasé about it. Oh yeah, plan, do, check, act. The big thing is, we all tend to focus on the doing. But it is the planning in particular that engages the whole leadership and puts that whole culture in place to make that doing work. And it is that checking and continuing improvement that maintain the validity of that operation. So when we look at some of the requirements in NIS2 around management, involvement, and around checking the effectiveness, again, it all pushes to the plan, do, check, act approach. The controls, very briefly, are in 4 groups. Organizational, covering things like policies, responses to incidents. Straight away, we've seen that goes straight into NIS2. Legal requirements, obviously again, and business continuity. People, awareness and training, and as I'll come on to later, things like responsibilities on termination of employment and disciplinary process. This will be important for later on. Physical controls, technological controls, such as use of cryptography. Again, a direct reference and cross-link here to NIS2. Key point, those 93 controls are to be considered. They're not mandatory. It all comes down to your risk assessment. There is also, for most controls, pretty much a full page of implementation guidance in the supporting standard 27002. Anyone here familiar with 27002? A few hands go up. For those of you working with 27001 who haven't had access to that, it is an extremely useful document. And we'll come on to the parallels with 27002 and the new implementation regulation on NIS2 as well. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, but this is to show you there is a mapping of all the clauses and the annexes to the articles and specific requirements within NIS2. And as you can see, for each, let's take incident handling. You can see there are a whole load of requirements within Annex A of 27001, each of which has a page or more implementation guidance in 27002 to help you. And it's the same right the way across the board here. And again, if you look at things like basic cyber hygiene practices and training, there's a whole load of things here where 27001 can help. Likewise, human resources, security, access control policies, and asset management, a whole load of controls that can help. So some of the key steps in the process I've hinted at here already. And this is why it is a sensible route forward for addressing this too. The scoping exercise is a formal exercise you have to conduct with a formal scoping document at the end of it. Determine the boundaries. Consider your context, your external issues. Are you an entity under NIS2, either an essential or important? If so, make sure your boundary is appropriate to address NIS2. That then sets your scoping document up. Risk management. We've already heard NIS2 takes a risk-based approach. Risk management is probably the single most important activity to be undertaken with the whole of 27001 and the whole of NIS2. And it's about firstly establishing the repeatable process, then performing the analysis and evaluating. When you're considering treatment, you have to consider those 93 controls, but as we'll come on to, you can also add other controls as appropriate for the risk. And then document that in your statement of applicability, saying which controls are in and why, and any of the reference ones you've omitted, why. So this process, I'll come on to, will streamline how you can actually address NIS2 through 27001. But now I'm going to move on to this. The NIS2 implementation regulation was published on the 17th of October, just about a day before I was going on holiday to Spain. So my last day before going to Spain in the torrential rain was very frantically reading through this and then making notes in the rain in Spain for the next week or so. So this details technical and methodological requirements for the risk measures under NIS2 and gives guidance on what constitutes a significant incident. How many people familiar with this yet? Any hands up? There's a few, not so many. So this is publicly available, and as you'll see, it is an absolute goldmine for useful implementation guidance. It's based largely on 27001 and 27002. Now, there is 27 pages of very useful guidance here. So absolutely fantastic. As ever, get through all this, there's a little but question at the end here. Now, in this case, it specifically applies to digital sectors such as DNS, TLD management, data center services, and managed services. And it looks like that's because they are largely cross-border issues. So these are things that may go across several different countries. So it looks like this implementation is then to standardize the approach and make it more straightforward for how these cross-border services comply with NIS2. But these 27 pages of detail are really invaluable. A couple more slides here to show you on this. So the clauses here then align to those NIS2 10 requirements. So for the first NIS2 requirement was around policies on risk analysis and information security. The first two clauses of this implementation guidance give a lot more detail on roles, responsibilities, authorities, risk management framework, compliance monitoring, independent review, all of which, that's exactly the kind of thing covered in 27001 and 27002. Incident handling. Those of you familiar with the controls in 27001 Annex A, 27002, some of these are directly taken from it, but all this guidance is there, freely available for everybody. likewise, business continuity, supply chain security. And look at that. I mentioned how complicated the acquisition, development, and maintenance was. All this extra guidance, patch management, network security, vulnerability handling and disclosure, change management. Again, you'll see a lot of this ties in directly with 27001 and the guidance in 27002. And then all the way through here, again, you can see direct mapping, further explanation. Cryptography, again, very, very similar structure to how this is managed in 27001 Annex A and 27002. And then Clause 9, that complicated one, human resources, security, access protection, asset management. Here they split that into 3 separate clauses with a lot of very, very useful detailed implementation, all of which is very much aligned with 27001 and 27002. So this now gives a great deal more detail and clarity. So implementing NIS2 requirements within 27001, I've mentioned this before. Scoping determines whether NIS2 applies, and then you need to make sure your boundaries cover all the relevant areas of the organization. Risk management, the most important element here, is selecting the appropriate reference and controls, add to the reference controls as required to ensure NIS2 requirements are met. So you can take a process. Let's say you're already 27001 certified. Anyone here 27001 certified? There's a few. If you are already, you can actually use the mapping of 27,000 controls to NIS2 requirements, ensure the relevant controls are included. If you need anything else, add it in, potentially use that implementation guidance. And that then becomes your way of demonstrating you've met the NIS2 conformance requirements. One point I forgot to mention, by the way, this risk assessment is absolutely key. And there is further guidance in ISO 27005. And we'll come on to that. We actually have a training course specifically on 27005 risk assessment for information security management. So that's one approach. It's very, very subjective and dependent. And bear in mind the detailed implementation guidance has just come out. We're currently just working through to come up with some implementation guidance. But this is where again, it comes back to, irrespective of NIS2, the key point is looking at your risk within your organization and think, does this control cover that risk to a point that I'm happy with? So whether or not it's NIS2, this is a very, very important point. And certainly 27005 can help you, because part of that is how you determine your risk criteria, your risk appetite as a business. So that's the key point here. So I strongly recommend taking a look at that guidance in 27005. And certainly we've got some training around that as well. That will make it, as part of that training, we actually do run through some exercises like that to actually allow you to apply it for real, so you can see where something needs extra control or where it doesn't. So that's one route. There is another route. Oh, sorry. And finally, statement of applicability then clarifies any additional controls and justifies any exclusions. So that's one route. But what you could also do is include guidance as a direct reference within your statement of applicability. So rather than necessarily go through and map everything, you can then take that guidance, apply it as appropriate to your organization, and reference it in your statement of applicability. And then from an auditing perspective, we would then be seeing how you've looked at that detailed implementation guidance and have you covered that effectively for your organization. So you reference it in the statement of applicability, justifying any changes or omissions from it. Remember that all of this, including NIS2 itself, is risk-based. And then if by including the implementation regulation, you then exclude some of the reference controls, you then justify that in there, saying they're covered by the implementation regulation. So going back to this point here, those 93 are for reference only. And if there is other guidance that is more appropriate, then you bring it in to your scope of assessment and implementation and certification. So this provides potentially a clean and straightforward way for bringing in the NIS2 requirements and implementation. Now, obviously, as I've said, the implementation was directed at the more digital services that are more cross-natural, but it sets the bar for this is what implementation of NIS2 looks like, particularly from a cross-border perspective. So just to summarize then, NIS2 focuses on governance without management accountability. Your managers are directly liable for infringements. However, it's a risk-based, pragmatic approach, those top-level requirements plus governing and reporting the procedure for serious incidents. 27001 provides a route for compliance across all member states. Also focuses on governance, risk-based, and it's flexible. Very much aligned with NIS2, and that process of scoping, risk treatment, and stapling of applicability is where you can bring in the NIS2 requirements. As I mentioned, most countries are delayed in transposing international law, but there's still pressure and requirements on organizations to move towards compliance through 2025. Belgium, the most advanced, and cites 27001 as a route for demonstrating compliance, provided the scope and SOA are appropriate, and it's an approved certification body. The new Commission implementation regulation gives a lot more detail, 27 pages of detail, closely aligned with 27001. Though it's created for the digital service sector, provides further general guidance that's extremely useful. Implement the NIS2 requirements either using that mapping, particularly if you've already implemented 27001, or add the implementation guidance directly into your statement of applicability. Now that's all straightforward to me, but I'm sure there's a lot of information to take in. So just want to finish off with how we can help you a bit more. Firstly and primarily training. Training against 27001, either just looking at the requirements, awareness, implementing, or internal auditing. 27005 for risk management, cybersecurity in general, business continuity, and much more. Gap assessment. Understand any gaps between your current info management system and, say, your requirements against NIS2. And finally, certification. Differentiate and build trust internally that you're on top of issues like NIS2, and externally through certification. So that's a QR link to the website from our local office here in the Netherlands. But please also do come and visit us on the booth just over there. And I think I've got a few minutes for any questions, if you have any questions. Thank you very much. Any questions? If you have them now, if not, not now, please come and see them on the booth. Yes, we have one question. Sorry. Sorry.
Apply the norm 27001. You already are compliant to NIS2?
You have, so this is where the point around, you have to make sure the scope covers the right part of your organization. And in your statement of applicability, you're taking into account the legal obligations, which include NIS2. You then have to do the work, but if those two things are there, that says that you covered the right area of your business and you're including your legal requirements under NIS2. You still need to be audited to say that you are compliant, and you have to do the work of implementing, but that's why the Belgian authorities can say if your scope and your statement of applicability is right, you have to have taken into account NIS2. Now, you still have to be audited that you've covered all the points, but that's why they are saying it's a potential route forward for demonstrating compliance. Does that make sense? If you need some more clarity, sometimes maybe if saying it just in English, if it's not your language, might be difficult, because it's so, there's the kind of, the legal implications of that, it's quite complex. But you have to make sure the scope, statement of applicability cover it, and then you've actually done the work. But if you have, that becomes a way of demonstrating compliance.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Hope that's clear.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.